Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for that generous introduction. If I were here talking about British political history, I don't think I would have an audience as large as this, but instead I'm here to talk to you about money, which is something of probably rather more universal interest. Okay, so obviously you're thinking about postgraduate study, and you're obviously the natural question that arises from that, as well as what you want to study, is of course how on earth you're going to pay for it, given how much it costs and all the rest of it. In this talk, I'm principally going to be talking to you about what I characterize as alternative sources of postgraduate funding, alternative approaches. I will say a little bit about mainstream sources of funding as well, but primarily this will be about alternative approaches. Mainstream sources are a lot more to find out, easy to find out about, and there's lots of very good information available through universities such as King's. Have a look on the website and you'll find out a great deal more. By means of introduction, this publication obviously is a book. It's also a website as well. There are some CD copies that are available by the table at the door of the book version of the alternative guide, and also some little flyers there which tell you how you as King's students can go on and create an account for free on the alternative guide to postgraduate funding online. The book version and the website version essentially have the same information, but some of the aspects of the website version are searchable. So we've been very generous and given you the opportunity to enjoy the guide for free in both its different forms. Of course, the reason why I suppose I'm giving this talk now is because, as was said, I funded actually my whole PhD through these kind of alternative approaches. I wasn't successful at getting mainstream funding, in my case through the Arts and Humanities Research Council or any other university scholarships, but I was very successful with getting a large number of different awards from these alternative sources, principally charities, trusts and foundations, which I shall explain to you about during the course of this talk. Essentially then, there are really, I suppose, these two kinds of funding that I'm outlining. Plan A and Plan B. Now, Plan A is to get a public scholarship, or a scholarship from a university, or a scholarship from a research council, and I'll say a little bit more about research councils in one moment. This is essentially to fund your PhD or master's. This would give you a very, very large contribution towards your fees, or indeed all of your fees, and a stipend per month of probably around, with London weighting, maybe £1,100, something like that, actually maybe £1,200. Obviously, this is great if you can get it. In theory, this means that you won't have to pay any fees, and you will have more than enough to be able to live off on a monthly basis, and with some PhDs also a small research budget along the side as well. So this is the real kind of gold standard thing here. There are many opportunities that are available of this kind at King's College London. Different universities have different amounts, I suppose, of public funding. King's College London does indeed have quite a lot. I suppose the plan B, though, if you don't get this kind of funding, and of course that kind of funding is tremendously competitive and only a minority of students succeed in getting it, there's the plan B. The plan B is really to think about your funding package much more holistically. And this obviously can include things like savings and part-time work, as you might imagine, but it also can include other smaller funders, principally charities, trusts and foundations, which are really the backup here. Now, with charities and trusts, there are many thousands of independent bodies, but I'll say a little bit more about public funding first. So, public funding. So there are research councils, of which there are 7 in Britain, that represent the main kind of subject areas. 2 of them are listed here, the AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council, the ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council. There's also the MRC, the Medical Research Council, EPSRC, Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and also 3 others as well that represent the subject domains. You may have already heard about these bodies. They're very well known about. There's a lot of public information available. Now, if you get scholarships for your PhD or master's from these bodies, this is the proverbial full whack that I mentioned, i.e. all of your fees paid for and also research expenses as well. For the most part, these full scholarships are available only to EU students or UK students. However, there are also some other schemes that are available that might not be through research councils that are also available to overseas students as well. Universities can have their own kind of awarding competitions as well, which is often funded off the nations of alumnus. Generally speaking, with PhD awards, this is where most of the public funding is. There are a small number of standalone master's awards that exist in certain subjects, but very often funding for masters is attached to a PhD on the side. This is a so-called 1+3 award. This essentially means that you, if you get an award, you do your masters, and then you have also funding in place for a PhD as well, should you wish to continue to one. Although, of course, it ought to be your stated intention to continue to a PhD at the point when you are applying for your masters. It varies from subject to subject, from university to university, whether there is an individual masters competition or a so-called 1+3 masters competition. With PhD awards, they're usually always 3 years, except in some cases, in some of the sciences, where they will actually fund you for a 4th year as well, because some PhDs nowadays often do take 4 years. In terms of how this all works, usually what happens is the money from the Research Council is administered by the university. So essentially you decide the topic in consultation with your supervisor, PhD level, your prospective supervisor, and as part of a departmental award, they go into a departmental competition or a school-based competition, and funding can be achieved for those projects. There are also many pre-funded projects which are available to supervisors. For example, in the sciences, a supervisor might have a large grant to do something, and they will also have some PhD students there attached on the side, and then also some master's students as well. So in that case, you would effectively be applying for a PhD or a master's, which was in an area which was predefined, which existed within the remits of the project that that supervisor had, rather than getting to decide the topic yourself. In the arts and humanities and social sciences, however, it's much more a question of you deciding what your topic is, then approaching a supervisor, developing it, and then applying to the university to see whether you can get one of these prestigious public funding awards. As I said, often these are hugely competitive. But the best piece of advice that really can be given, I think, is 2 things. Number 1, find out about them. And I think the best sources of information are obviously university website and the internet, but also departmental administrators at university departments who really know about the specifics of how these competitions work on a university by university and department by department basis. Also, at PhD level, close collaboration and close contact with the prospective supervisor is absolutely vital, both in terms of developing your project, but also generally in terms of getting yourself better known at the department that you are applying for funding for. Obviously, if you have a prior existing relationship with an academic, that will almost certainly obviously work in your favor, because it can allow you to develop ideas rather than obviously just coming in completely cold. But I'm not going to say that much more about public funding, because this, as I say, is very, very easy to find out about, and only a relatively small number of people get this, although this should definitely be, I suppose, your aspiration. There are also, I suppose, a few other sources of funding that are outside of the alternative funding sector. There is a new postgraduate loans competition that was actually announced a few months ago by the Chancellor. No one knows very much about this yet, because the details still haven't been fleshed out, but it's quite possible that by the time you come to apply for postgraduate study, there will be a postgraduate loan system in place, whereby you will be able to take out £10,000 for a master's course, and then actually, as per a recent announcement in the last budget, actually for PhDs as well, £10,000 a year. Although the actual nature of what that competition will look like and what the interest repayments will be like isn't known at the moment, but it's definitely something to look out for, and it is an exciting development which obviously will help fund postgraduate study for people who don't get this Research Council scholarship, which is obviously a grant. There are also career development loans as well. These are up to £10,000 in vocational master's subjects for the most part. And then also, obviously, there are internal university funds, and there's a URL right there, pretty easy to find out about, the KCL postgraduate funding database, which obviously lists opportunities that are available at KCL in addition to the Research Councils and public scholarships. However, what I'm going to talk about, though, for the rest of my talk is these so-called alternative funding sources. Now, these are primarily from charities and trusts, which is set up and sustained by private individuals for all manner of philanthropic purposes. Now, charities and trusts are often very, very varied in what they support. There are some charities and trusts which are very academic and are interested in funding academic study. For example, the Wellcome Trust or the British Heart Foundation, the Institute for Cancer Research. Some of them actually do full PhDs. However, the vast majority of charities and trusts are actually very small bodies, maybe just run by some volunteers, maybe a few people at weekends in a farmhouse, for example, who are giving up their free time to run this charity. And many of these charities and trusts actually have never funded postgraduate study before, or undergraduate study before, indeed. And increasingly, I think, students are beginning to wake up to the possibility that these charities and trusts might actually fund them for their postgraduate study as well. And really, the Alternative Guide to Postgraduate Funding in this talk is really all about how you can access those charities and trusts. Now, there are tens of thousands of them, and many of them have very, very varied priorities and eligibility criteria. Some of them are not especially academic. Some of them, for example, might not actually mind that much about the intricacies of what you're studying. They're more interested in a general idea of whether your studies will make you a better person and also maybe ultimately the world a better place. So this might be, whether, for example, in your research, you might be developing some kind of new drug which is going to save people's lives. Or maybe you're researching some kind of overlooked historical area, maybe, which you can see some kind of public application for, like maybe like a museum exhibition or something like this. And also, of course, the development as you as a researcher or indeed as somebody who is gaining skills to make them more employable. Obviously, one of the benefits of postgraduate study that you may have heard about today is obviously it makes you more employable, it does increase your sort of salary prospects, and can make you obviously a part of the workforce which is in greater demand. In academic research, of course, it enables you, a PhD, to become a lecturer, to go into academia, to teach other people. So all of these are benefits as well that charities and trusts will be interested in. So some examples of charities and trusts. So a general one to start with is Sir Richard Stapley Educational Trust. This is for students who are of 24 years of age and over. I think it's up to £1,000 a year and pretty much any subject area. Getting stranger still is the Vegetarian Charity. This is a charity for vegetarian and vegan students. And this will also support people up to the tune of £1,000 a year. The Lever Home Trades Charities Trust. This is dependent upon what your parents did for a living or your grandparents did for a living. So if you are descended from grocers, pharmacists, or travelling salespeople, the Lever Home Trades Charities Trust is worth up to £5,000 a year. They also actually, incidentally, have an undergraduate bursary competition as well, and if any of you are going into, say, third year of your undergraduate course, there is an undergraduate award from these guys worth £3,000 as well. I actually got funding from this charity based on the fact that my father used to sell biscuits in Grimsby in the 1970s. And so you would never have thought, and my father would never have thought, as he pushed the McVitie's wagon up the hill with the Jamaica ginger cake in it and all the rest of it, that this would have been paying for his son's postgraduate study rather sometime later. The Merlin Trust. So this is for students to go and study plants in their natural habitat. That's quite exciting, isn't it? So you can go up to a mountain and look at an orchid or something like that. The Royal Golf Charitable Trust. This is probably one of the strangest charities that you'll encounter. This is for people who are good at golf. So essentially, there's a man who lives in a shed somewhere in Scotland, and you can go up there and challenge him to a round of golf, and if you defeat him, it gives you £5,000. However, unfortunately, because he's some washed-up ex-pro, he's pretty good, and so he's never been defeated. So there you go. You could try challenging him. Big and Tall Charitable Trust for people of more than 6'4" tall. To extend your bed, to make it longer, to stop your feet falling off. That's what they like you to spend the grants on anyway. And also there are many, many less weird and bizarre charities that don't depend on you being 6'4" or good at golf, or indeed both. For example, the Sidney Perry Foundation, the Roger and Sarah Bancroft Clerk Charitable Trust, the Sir Richard Stapley Educational Trust, which I just mentioned. But the point of this is that charities are very, very diverse in what they give money for. And often the reasons why people give money to charity may reflect their own particular pet desires. Many charities set up in the late 19th century, and so many of them have a quite kind of old-fashioned feel, I suppose. And they often and that's why they're interested in supporting people who are descended from people who practiced particular trades. As for why charities and trust, well, it's a plan B, obviously. If you don't get your full scholarship, this represents a way that you can get some funding together. How much funding would be the question? Well, charity and trust awards are probably going to range from £500 to £2,000 each, with some exceptions of some larger ones, like Lever Home that I mentioned. However, there are some pretty cool things with these. You can win many awards at the same time. I won quite a large number during my PhD. And also, throughout, say, a longer course, maybe a part-time master's or a PhD, which is several years, they tend to fund you for each of those years. And so a £1,000 award won in year one of your PhD might be £3,000 in year three or £4,000 in year four if you go into a fourth year. So there are ways of getting these amounts of money to snowball and become larger, to assemble a sort of a basket full of awards. There are also, of course, extra costs that are not covered by a scholarship. So even if you have a full Research Council scholarship, you might still need extra money for research, travel, conferences, etc. Charities and trusts can be a useful way of getting hold of that as well, and of course for fourth-year funding too. But the other thing, I suppose, really, is that charities and trusts are often not as competitive as research councils. Sure, there are some very well-known charities, for example, the British Foundation for Women Graduates, which is a very competitive charity. You probably need a first-class degree to be able to get funding from them. But with many of these other charities, actually finding them is actually the difficult thing. If you manage to find them, very often you may find that there are not very many applicants, especially if it's maybe a very local charity, maybe a charity that hasn't funded postgraduate study anywhere before. Very often people find charities based actually on things like their local connections. For example, if you, live in a small town or a village, asking the someone at the church hall or somebody at the library, if they know anything about local charities. Very often there are bodies that exist there, and sometimes they do actually end up funding students, and indeed even postgraduate students. But generally speaking, though, and I've said some of these things already, the voluntary sector are not like research councils. As I say, they are usually very informal, and they don't mind that much about what you are studying a lot of the time. Some of them are big, some of them are small. Furthermore, also, I think the fact that their eligibility criteria is often quite varied. It matters a lot, not just what you're studying, but also who you are, where you're from, aspects of your background, aspects of your biography. And so consequently, your list of funders or potential funders will probably be quite different from somebody else's. They're also very flexible as well, which is quite nice. Sometimes there are multiple deadlines a year for charities and trusts. Now, this also means that you can apply in advance of your course starting, no more than a year in advance, though, and you can also apply during your course. I was successful in getting funding from charities and trusts before my course, and indeed during it, and indeed throughout it. And obviously, if you want to really make a go of charities and trusts, you should be thinking about applying for funding also throughout your course as well. Also, charities are just a lot more human than big academic scholarships. They don't mind if you phone them up, and talk to them and ask whether you're eligible and that sort of thing, and they can genuinely be quite helpful. There's also a phenomenon that I like to call the snowball effect, which is that when you win one award from a charity, even if it's for £500, £1,000, other charities are much more likely to fund you once you've gotten that. Other charities don't like being the only funder of something. They like working with other bodies as part of a sort of more holistic funding picture. Of course, sometimes there can be a bit of a chicken and egg situation here, because obviously if you start with nothing, it can be quite difficult to get your first award. Sometimes it can be worth actually applying to one of the small pots of money that is available maybe at King's, like, for example, a conference scholarship that might exist from the graduate school. And if you can get one of those small university awards, then you can maybe also use that to get charities and trusts as well. But nonetheless, there are still many ways of getting the ball rolling as well, even if you aren't successful in getting any money from your university. Right, let's talk a little bit about finding charities and trusts now, because as I say, one of the real challenges with this is finding them. The thing is to have a look around, mostly using the internet, but also a number of other things too. When you see a charity on the internet, do bear in mind that you won't get comprehensive information about whether you're eligible for it. Many charities don't necessarily have websites, and even if they do have entries on general database websites, there's usually not much data available. Plus, charities sometimes change their eligibility criteria, and also they simply stop giving out money at certain times, and you're not going to know that unless you actually sort of write to them. But the thing is that when you see a body and the description is quite vague, you might want to just put it down on your list of potentials. Then you can send them an email or a letter later, and the worst they can say is no. In terms of where to look online, obviously having a look at university funding pages. A university like King's College London already has a postgraduate funding database, which you can find linked to on the King's main postgraduate funding pages. You can also have a look in the Alternative Guide to Postgraduate Funding. Now, there's a static list of 500 charities, which is on that CD version, or the book, which has the book version of the guide on it. But also, on the Alternative Guide to Postgraduate Funding online, the URL is there on the screen. It's also on those flyers at the front, where you can just create an account with your kcl.ac.uk email address, you'll find a searchable database of around 800 charities that you can have a look at. And this ought to get you a very, very long way in hunting for funding. You will also find some other useful websites around: postgraduate studentships, scholarship search, uni grants, research professional, the British Council, and also some charity search engines too. There's one particularly useful charity search engine called Turn to Us, which probably has more of a sort of an emphasis on looking for maintenance and fee awards. You can also look in the local library as well. Have a look in the Educational Grants Directory, the Grants Register, the Directory of Grants-Making Trusts. I mean your local library when I say this, not so much a university library, although KCL Careers Service has at least a couple of these books available as well. Some charities that aren't available anywhere on the internet are in some of these books. It's easy to overlook these old-fashioned mechanisms of looking, but actually sometimes you'll find that the ones in the book actually have a lot less applicants than the ones that are available on the internet, and that's obviously ultimately good for you if you come to apply to them. You can also ask for advice too. Essentially, you can ask even your local council. Now, it would really be a question of either ringing up or emailing the education division and saying, I'm interested in charitable grants to fund postgraduate study. Do you have anything available, or do you know about anything? Local councils know a lot about things that are available in the local area, like phone up Barnet Council or phone up Barking and Dagenham Council. Sometimes also councils effectively control charities as well. When local charities cease to operate, maybe the trustees move on or they retire or they die or whatever, the grant-making powers of local charities are sometimes absorbed by a local council. So local councils actually sometimes run a number of charities. So that's why they can be sensible to ask. You can also ask local parish councils as well. This is, I know, I appreciate, very, very obscure, but around a third of postcodes in England and Wales have a parish council. Sometimes they have money they're prepared to give away. To find out about parish councils, just ask the General Inquiries team at your local council. If number one, you have a parish council, give them your postcode, and number two, whether they have any contact details. You can also initially approach charities. After you've got, say, a list, you've looked in the, on the internet, you've looked at books in the library, you've asked for advice, etc., you should have a list of potential charities now. It might be a quite long list. You might have 50 potential charities indeed. Now you have to poke them with essentially a short letter, email, or phone call. What this initial letter of inquiry should look like, you can see it either in the Alternative Guide to Postgraduate Funding, it's on both the book and the website. It should really just be a very, very short letter which should say that you have a place to do, make sure you apply after you've got a place, incidentally, to do a master's course or a PhD at King's College London, and that you have a deficit in your funding package for it and you are looking to raise money. You might want to say that that money will be used to pay for your tuition fees or maybe for your maintenance. And you should send these emails out or these letters out and really await results. These letters are not the place to make long, complicated arguments about why your research is awesome or about why your program is going to make you much more employable. You can save that for your main application. These should be short, professional, business-like. Send out the emails, send out the letters. Obviously, if the charity has an email address, use that. If not, it's going to be a letter in the post, which you should attach a stamped self-addressed envelope to, which is just an envelope with your name and address on and enough postage to pay for 6 to 8 pieces of A4 paper. That's important because a lot of charities won't actually reply to you unless you put the stamped self-addressed envelope in. They can be very, very petulant about that. They like to have the stamped self-addressed envelope. So send them all out. At this point, you're going to get lots of disappointment, unfortunately. A lot of charities will just ignore you, unfortunately. And of the charities that do reply to you, a lot of your letters will come back saying no. Examples of saying no might be that they whip out some piece of eligibility criteria that wasn't on the website or wasn't in the book or the database that you looked at. For example, they might say, well, actually, we only fund people from Guernsey or something like that. And you thought, okay. Or they may simply say something like, actually, we don't fund individuals, we only fund organizations. That's a quite common reason. Or they may simply say, we don't have any money at the moment, sorry, come back later. That's also quite common. So you have to make sure that the charity is actually prepared for you to apply at this time. However, some positive responses will come through from this, and you will get some charities which say, okay, yep, here's the application form, this is the deadline, go ahead and apply. Once you've put the charities you've found through that filtering process, the ones that come out the other end, you have a much, much higher chance of getting funding from those. Many, many students who apply to charities don't do it like this. They just simply write letters to a large number of charities they see without getting the charities to invite them to apply. Very, very crucial intermediary step, which is often missed. In terms of the application forms themselves, charity application forms are usually very simple, usually only a couple of pages long. There's no monster applications like there are for formal scholarships or indeed academic jobs. In terms of how you should approach this, the main thing is a personal statement or a cover letter, which is about 500 to 800 words, and this is really where you make your case for funding. Now, a few things that are important here and that differentiate this kind of application from an application you would make for a research council scholarship. Decide what the body's priority is. Is it an academic charity? If so, by all means, talk about your research. Is it interested in the fact that your father sold biscuits in Grimsby in the 1970s? If so, talk about selling biscuits in Grimsby in the 1970s. If it's interested in the betterment of your research or the skills that you're acquiring to society, talk a little bit about that. A couple of lines at the beginning should be about what you want to aim for, because of course you want to be able to reuse most of your application when you apply to other bodies as well. The crucial thing here is if you're doing research in particular, doing a PhD, pluck it down from the academic stratosphere, make it easy to understand to society, and try and make it seem beneficial as well. Now, this isn't a place to talk about your post-structuralist reinterpretation of the Hegelian dialectic or whatever it is that you are interested in studying at PhD level. Try and make it, explain it as though you're talking to, I suppose, an intelligent member of the general public, who is the kind of person who will be looking at your application. Now, of course, with benefit to society, that's easier for some people than others. So obviously, if you're a scientist and you're studying some disease, you can just say, yeah, man, I'm saving lives. And that's the end of the argument, really. That's clearly very, very beneficial. If you're a historian like me, the best you can probably do is make it sound interesting. So, for example, my PhD, which is about 19th and 20th century elections at King's College London, about election speeches, the way I tried to make that sound interesting was to say, oh, well, we're very interested in how politicians use language to convince people to vote for them, whether it's Tony Blair or Barack Obama or David Cameron or something, i.e. spin, and my PhD is about how did spin begin. Now, it wasn't really about that, but it was a way of packaging it in such a way as made it seem relevant, made it seem interesting to a modern audience. So find ways of making your work sound great, sound interesting and sound important. Easier, of course, for some people than others. The most important thing, though, is to have a clear financial plan. Now, although charities are philanthropic bodies, they are also interested in essentially the bottom line, which is the money they're going to give you going to get you through your course? Or are you going to be, obviously, one of the people of which there are at any university, of course, who doesn't actually manage to complete their course? And so they like the idea of funding someone who is conceived of their study at master's or PhD level as a financial as well as an academic entity. They like the idea of thinking that you're someone there with an Excel spreadsheet looking at your monthly income and outgoing. And so if you give the impression of having a clear financial plan, then it will give the charity a great deal more confidence that the money they give you isn't going to be wasted. Also, have a clear vocational aim. The charity wants to know why you're doing this postgraduate study. A perception sometimes exists in society, which is, of course, now wholly wrong, that postgraduate study is an indulgence, which, of course, it's not. And they want to be confident that you are doing this for a good reason, that it's going to make you more employable, that it's going to lead to you becoming a researcher because obviously you need to have a PhD to become a lecturer. I'm obviously a very simple argument. All of us know that, but do people in general society know that? Not necessarily. So seem very focused, seem very clear. In terms of these financial statements, well, I don't have enough time to go through all of it, but what should it look like? It should have two parts, essentially. The first part is really there to show the charity what other charities you have applied for. Charities like the idea that you've approached some other bodies and not just them. They don't like the idea that you've opened the grants register, stuck a pin in it and said that one. They like the idea of you having a fair few that you've also looked at. This gives the charity the confidence that they are part of a bigger plan rather than just the recipient of just an ad hoc plea for help. Now, obviously, if you win an award from another charity, then again, so much the better. That makes you seem even stronger. But if you haven't got one yet, at least show that you are trying to get others. In terms of your financial, the main financial statement, which is the pink box, It's going to be a tabulation of your expenses and income. So what should your expenses be? Well, they're going to be your course fees. Of course, that's going to vary a great deal according to what program you're doing, whether you're an international student or a home student. Of course, there will be a lot of differences there. Then there's going to be rent and then a bunch of other miscellaneous costs. London's expensive, obviously you know that, and so what you put down for that will probably be a bit higher than other people elsewhere would. But certainly, a living expenses of the equivalent of a research council stipend, which would be something like £1,100, £1,200 a month for a single person living in London with no kids, is by no means, maybe a sensible guideline to budget for. You may then have income as well. Where could income be from? Well, it could be from part-time work, it could be through savings, it could be from other charities and trusts, it could also be through loans as well. Obviously, if you get one of these postgraduate loans that's coming in and you've got, obviously £10,000 there of loans, a couple of £1,000s of something else, you might only have a couple of £1,000 deficit that you need to make up. You're then obviously going to have a shortfall of a certain amount of money. Some charities, this person's got £6,000 shortfall for a year. Some charities and trusts will want to know if their maximum award is £2,000, what your plan is for getting the other £4,000. And that's why, obviously, that table there is important. Generally, though, there are a few other things as well, and I will be brief. References as well is important. This is going to be from your prospective supervisor if you're a PhD student or someone else at King's who knows you well, maybe your final year project supervisor or anyone else. These are mainly there so that the charity knows you are who you say you are. They don't matter that much in terms of what they actually say with charities and trusts. It's not like with scholarships or with an academic job where who writes the reference is important. You should just, you might want to ask your prospective supervisor or the person who writes the reference to actually give you a generic reference or an open reference, which is addressed to whom it may concern, or dear sir, stroke madam, which says that you're going to be doing a master's course at King's, that you're an awesome student, preferably. It would help if they said that too, and that you have a deficit in your funding package too. Other things you can do, you can actually write to say thanks if you're successful, and also write them a little report at the end of the year. That's particularly important if you're doing a course of more than 1 year, because it tends to mean that they'll roll the award over in subsequent years if things are going okay. Finally, and to close, just a few what I might characterize as golden rules with this. Obviously, this is a very whistle-stop talk on an area which is relatively complicated. First of all, with charities, make sure you're eligible to apply to them. The way you do this is with that initial email or initial letter of inquiry. Don't waste your time putting in an application or writing a big long letter before you actually know whether the charity, you're eligible for it, and that they're giving out money at the moment too. So that's why you've got to touch base first. Secondly, understand the charity's priorities. Are they interested in research? Are they interested in funding awesome students? Are they simply interested in funding somebody who has a good financial plan? And tailor your applications a little. Keep your research simple and easy to understand, and try and show how it may benefit scholarship or society. And if you're doing more of a master's course to improve your skill set, also show how this is going to make you that much more employable. Have that vocational purpose that I mentioned as well. Don't make them think it's an indulgence. Have a clear financial plan. And then finally, this is obviously a plan B. This isn't ideal compared to, say, the plan A of getting full scholarship, but it does represent, I suppose, another alternative path whereby you can fund postgraduate study, maybe with some other things as well, maybe with some part-time work on the side and some savings. And some of the awards, if you look for them, are surprisingly easy to find. Not very many people use this kind of funding at the moment. Those numbers are growing, but there still does represent an opportunity to be able to get funding relatively, maybe comparatively easily in some cases, via these mechanisms that may not always be there. I think that concludes my talk, and I'm now very happy to take any questions that you might have.